At 88, Priscilla finally admitted the 4 words Elvis told her before he died. He said her name so softly that at first she thought she imagined it, not because of the hour, not because of the surprise, but because of the tone. Elvis never sounded like that, not even during the worst nights, not even during the years when everything felt scattered and fragile. Something in his voice trembled, as if the words were trying to outrun whatever was chasing him. Prison. Just that one syllable, but it was enough to make her sit up straight, her heart thudding in that old familiar rhythm she wished she'd outgrown. It had been years since she'd heard him like this, years since he'd reached for her with anything other than casual warmth or friendly habit. But that night, the way he breathed between words, it felt like a confession trying to surface. She didn't interrupt, she didn't ask questions, she just listened, because she already knew he wasn't calling to talk about business or Lisa or some show he wanted her to see. This wasn't one of their easy check-ins. This was something heavier, something he'd been carrying alone for far too long. There was a crackle in the line, that small whisper of static that comes from a long-distance call. It suited the moment. It felt like the universe was holding its breath with her. Elvis cleared his throat, tried to steady himself, failed. She could hear it, the struggle of a man who wanted to sound strong but couldn't quite gather the strength. "Are you awake?" he finally asked. She said yes, even though she'd been on the edge of sleep, drifting in and out of memories she never fully let go of. The truth didn't matter in moments like this. What mattered was that he was reaching for her, and something inside her told her she needed to meet him halfway. For a few seconds, neither of them said anything, not out of discomfort, but because silence had always been part of their language. They never needed to fill every moment. Their bond was built on years of understanding the words people don't say aloud. Then he laughed, a small, almost embarrassed sound that stopped too quickly, as if it hurt to release it. "I didn't mean to call this late," he said. But she knew he did. Elvis Presley never did anything unintentionally, especially when it came to the people he trusted, and he trusted so few. She didn't call him out on the lie, she just murmured, "It's okay," and waited for the real reason to surface. But he didn't say it, not yet. Instead, he asked how she'd been doing, how her week looked, if she'd eaten dinner, questions that sounded casual on the surface but carried an undercurrent of something deeper, something fearful, as if he was circling a truth he wasn't ready to reveal, as if he needed to hear her voice steady before he opened the door to whatever was clawing at him. She answered calmly, keeping her tone soft, gentle, familiar. She didn't want him to retreat. She could feel the fragility in him, the kind of fragility he never showed publicly. To the world, Elvis was a storm of charisma and power, but on that call, he sounded like a man letting his armor slip. Then came the moment she would replay for decades. He exhaled shakily and said, "I couldn't sleep." She asked why. He hesitated, then whispered, "I keep thinking about things from back then." Back then. The phrase landed like a spark in dry grass. It carried years inside it, years of love, years of chaos, years of mistakes they both spent their lives trying not to drown in. She felt her throat tighten, but she didn't interrupt. Any sudden movement, any wrong tone, and she knew he'd pull back into himself. He kept talking, drifting between half-formed thoughts, touching memories like fragile objects. He mentioned the house they first shared, the nights they stayed up until sunrise, the way she used to smooth down the curls at the back of his neck when he nodded off on the couch. He mentioned the way she laughed back then, unguarded and bright. He mentioned how young they both were, too young for the life they were thrown into. It wasn't nostalgia, she could tell it was something else, something that scared him. When he paused, she softly said his name, just once, just enough to let him know she was listening, truly listening. That was when his voice cracked. "I don't know if I ever told you, but there are things I wish I'd done different." Her breath caught. It wasn't like him to admit regret, not this openly. Elvis lived forward, always forward. Regret was a weight he avoided because he feared it would swallow him whole. Hearing him speak like this felt like witnessing a doorway open into a part of him he kept locked from everyone. She whispered, "Tell me, before she could stop herself. He didn't answer right away, and that silence, the long, thin, trembling silence, told her everything. He was wrestling with himself. She knew that pattern too well. He only spoke like this when he was close to falling apart. Finally, he said, "Pris, you were the only one who ever saw me before all this." She closed her eyes. She could picture him perfectly, hand pressed to his forehead, curling slightly inward, trying to hold his heart together long enough to speak. It was the tone he used only when he was stripped to the core, the tone he used during Red West's departure, the tone he used the night his mama died, the tone of a man on the edge of something he didn't know how to name. She tried to keep her voice steady as she reminded him, "You never had to be anything with me. You know that." He didn't argue, he didn't deflect, he just whispered, "I know." Then he said something that tightened every muscle in her chest. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if things had gone differently?" Another open loop, another truth trying to break free. She didn't know what to say. There were too many answers, some painful, some kind, some buried under years of distance. She picked the safest one. "Sometimes," she said. He went quiet, so quiet she thought the line had gone dead, but then he spoke again, softer than before. "I made you carry too much, more than any girl your age should have carried." Those words shook her, not because they weren't true, but because he'd never said them aloud. Not to her, not to anyone. Elvis Presley simply didn't speak in sentences like that. He protected the people he loved by pretending their pain didn't exist. He gave, he charmed, he dazzled, but he rarely acknowledged the cost they paid to be close to him. That night, he did. She didn't know if he was asking for forgiveness, or offering it, or drowning in some old guilt that had resurfaced after years of silence. Before she could gather her thoughts, he continued, "I don't want you thinking I ever forgot any of it." Her eyes strung. She swallowed hard and forced her voice to stay strong. "I never thought you did." But that wasn't entirely true. There were years, long, painful stretches, when she wondered if he'd ever understood the magnitude of what they'd lived. When the women changed, when the tour consumed him, when the fame became a kind of prison, she questioned if their story still mattered to him in any real way. Now, listening to him speak like this, she realized he'd carried their history quietly, secretly, the same way she had. It broke something open inside her. He shifted again, as he always did when emotional honesty felt dangerous. He talked about his shows, the exhaustion he couldn't shake, the pressure that followed him like a shadow. He joked lightly about Colonel Parker's stubbornness, but even through the jokes, she could hear it, the fear creeping in at the edges. There was a heaviness in him she'd never heard before. A heaviness that made her stomach twist. She asked him softly, "What's really going on?" He hesitated, then he said, almost like a confession, "I'm not sleeping, I'm not thinking straight. I feel like something's closing in." Her heartbeat stumbled. Elvis Presley never admitted fear, not to producers, not to friends, not to family, and certainly not to the world. He built an empire on appearing unshakable, yet here he was, sounding like a man finally realizing he could no longer outrun his own shadow. She whispered his name again. He didn't pull away this time. He exhaled, slow and shaky, and said, "Pris, I didn't know who else to call." That sentence alone rewrote something inside her, not because it was flattering, not because it meant he still needed her, but because it revealed something she had always suspected but never dared to believe fully. She was the person he reached for when he felt safest admitting the truth. Not because she wanted anything from him. Not because she worshipped him, but because she had known him before the world did. And he needed that anchor now more than ever. She could feel her pulse racing. She could feel her throat tightening. She could feel the weight of a moment forming, heavy, delicate, irreversible. And she knew, with a clarity that frightened her, that this wasn't just a late-night moment of weakness. This was a man preparing himself to say something he had avoided his entire life. But before he could say it, he grew quiet again, too quiet. She could hear him breathing, slow and uneven, as if searching for the right words, as if afraid of them. She almost spoke, almost told him he didn't have to explain, almost begged him to just rest, to just breathe, to just stay on the line a little longer. But she didn't, she waited. Because some truths can't be rushed. And then, just before he finally began to speak, she felt it, that cold shiver of dread running through her spine. The kind that tells you a life is about to change. The kind that tells you the person on the other end of the line is holding the heaviest truth they've ever carried. The kind that tells you you're about to hear something you won't be able to forget, even half a lifetime later. And in that suspended moment, she suddenly understood the question that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Why did he choose her, after everything, after the distance, after the years, to hear the one confession he never gave anyone else? She didn't get the answer that night, but she felt the weight of it. And she knew, somewhere deep inside her, that this call, this trembling, fragile, unexpected call, wasn't just a memory. It was the beginning of an ending she wasn't ready to face. She always said the years after the divorce were quieter, but not easier. People liked to imagine that once the papers were signed and the dust settled, Elvis and Priscilla drifted into separate worlds, two adults learning to live without each other. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was far messier, far more human. They weren't husband and wife anymore, but they were still bound together by something they couldn't name. And the more they tried to escape it, the tighter it pulled. That's what made that final call so complicated. It wasn't just a phone ringing in the night. It was the sound of years of unresolved emotion clawing its way back to the surface. Priscilla said that whenever Elvis called unexpectedly, her heart reacted before her mind did. She'd feel that old familiar tightening in her chest, the same one she felt as a teenager when his voice carried through the phone from Germany. It didn't matter that she was older, wiser, or that life had taken them in different directions. One sound from him, and suddenly it was all back. The love, the hurt, the laughter, the fear, the whole unfinished story. People always assume their divorce came from bitterness or betrayal, but that wasn't how either of them saw it. It was more like admitting they no longer fit the way they used to. But even after the papers, they weren't done, not emotionally. There were days they fought harder than they ever did while married. Days when he'd call her with frustration in his voice, and she'd meet him with her own exhaustion. They weren't arguing because they hated each other, they were arguing because they still cared too much. And that tension, it never really went away. She remembered one afternoon, years before that last call, when Elvis confronted her about a decision she'd made regarding Lisa Marie. He spoke with that blend of anger and vulnerability she always recognized. His voice would rise, but his eyes would soften. He wanted control, but he also wanted reassurance. She said that was the moment she realized something heartbreaking. Elvis didn't know how to love without holding on too tightly. She, on the other hand, didn't know how to love without giving too much. That was the trap they never escaped. And maybe that's why the call felt different from the very first second. She could sense something in the way he breathed, something in the way he paused before speaking, as if he needed to gather every piece of courage he had left. She'd heard his voice in every version over the years, angry, playful, needy, distant. But this one she'd never heard before. It was soft, like he was carrying something heavy he didn't want to drop. But before she could ask him about it, he changed the subject. He talked about Lisa Marie, about how proud he was of her, how she was finding her own voice, her own way. But even as he said the words, his tone didn't match them. He wasn't calling to talk about their daughter. He was circling something else. And deep down, she knew it. They'd always danced like that, speaking around the truth, never directly at it. Even when they were young, Elvis struggled to open up fully. He was a man raised on charm, privacy, and the heavy expectation of being the rock for everyone around him. You don't show weakness when the entire world looks to you for strength, not even to the woman you once loved more than life itself. So he circled, and she waited. That was their rhythm. Priscilla later admitted that a strange uneasiness crept into her stomach during those early minutes of the call. Not fear, intuition. Something about the way he kept returning to memories, small ones, insignificant ones, things she didn't even think he remembered. The way she used to brush hair off his forehead when he fell asleep on the couch. The way she always left the hallway light on in their first home because she knew he feared the dark sometimes. The way she made him laugh on days when fame felt like a weight he couldn't carry. Elvis wasn't reminiscing, he was revisiting pieces of himself. And that was always a sign he was wrestling with something deeper. What she didn't say publicly, but admitted once in a private conversation, was that she almost didn't answer the phone that night. She'd been exhausted, mentally worn out, lost in her own thoughts. At 88, she can still describe the way her hand hovered over the receiver. A part of her didn't want to step back into that old emotional gravity. Every time she did, it pulled her under. But something, instinct, fate, pushed her to lift the phone anyway. If she hadn't, she says she would have carried that regret for the rest of her life. People imagine Elvis as this towering symbol of confidence, a man carved from confidence and charisma, but those who knew him best knew he carried storms. He hid them behind jokes, behind work, behind the energy he poured into everyone else. But late at night, when the world quieted down, the storms were all he had left. On that call, Priscilla could hear one brewing. She remembered telling him, half-jokingly, "You sound like you're calling from 1,000 miles away." And he laughed, but the laugh was too short, too forced. It stopped before it reached his eyes. She asked him what was wrong. He said nothing. She asked again. He changed the subject. That was the night she realized something important. Elvis only avoided the truth when the truth scared him. Still, she didn't push. That was her mistake, she said. For decades she believed giving him space was an act of love, that he'd open up when he was ready. But she learned too late that some people never feel ready. Some people speak the truth only once in their entire lives, and if you miss that moment, it never comes back. They drifted into a conversation about their past, how young they'd been, how clueless, how reckless with the things that mattered. She admitted she missed the simplicity, the days before the pressure, before the fame became too sharp to touch. Elvis didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice softened in a way that scared her. "You were the only person who ever saw me before the world did." That sentence lingered between them like smoke, heavy, unspoken, loaded with a truth she'd avoided for years. Because even after the divorce, even after the heartbreak, she still carried the weight of being the one person who knew him before he belonged to everybody else. That kind of bond doesn't die. It mutates, it complicates, it tightens around the human heart in ways you can't explain without sounding foolish. She felt it breaking inside her again. But then something shifted. His voice changed, just slightly, enough for her to feel a prickle of fear run up her spine. He paused, took a breath, and then spoke with a seriousness that made her sit up straighter. "I've been thinking about things I haven't told anyone, things I maybe should have said a long time ago." Her heart began to race. The tone alone was enough. He wasn't joking. He wasn't reminiscing. He wasn't calling out of loneliness or impulse. He was calling with purpose. But before she could ask what he meant, he hesitated. She could almost hear him searching for the right words, the right tone, the right courage. It felt like he was standing at the edge of something he'd been running from his whole life. She waited, breath held, hands trembling slightly. But he didn't say it, not yet. Instead, he asked a question that blindsided her. "If things had been different, do you think we could have found our way back?" She didn't know how to answer. How could she? They had lived entire lifetimes in the silence between them. They had broken each other and saved each other, sometimes in the same breath. They had raised a daughter who adored them and resented them and needed them both. They had built homes together, torn them apart, and spent years pretending they were fine. "Different how?" she asked. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Everything they'd lost lived in that silence. But there was something else in his voice, something she couldn't identify then, but understood years later. He wasn't asking if they could reunite. He was asking if he had failed her. That question haunted her long after the call ended. She tried to reassure him, but he changed the subject again. He always did that, pulled back just when he was about to reveal something real. But this time, the retreat felt different, sharper, more painful. as if he wanted to say something but couldn't bring himself to let it out. She sensed the fear beneath his tone. She sensed the loneliness too, the kind that doesn't come from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who only want the strongest parts of you. Elvis had always been loved, but rarely understood. And on that call, he sounded like a man standing alone in a spotlight that had grown too bright. She wanted to ask him what he was really afraid of, but she didn't. She later admitted she didn't want to break the fragile peace of the moment. She didn't want to push him into a confession he wasn't ready for. She didn't want to hear something she couldn't unhear. Because deep down, she already felt the truth coming. And part of her wasn't ready to face it. Looking back, she said the most painful part wasn't what he said. It was what she held back. There was something she'd been carrying too, a truth she'd never shared with him, a truth she planned to say someday when the time felt right. But the time never came. Not then, not ever. And maybe that's why she almost dropped the phone when his voice wavered, when he inhaled shakily, when he said the sentence she didn't expect from him. Not from Elvis, not from the man who seemed immortal to the world. "I'm not doing as good as I tell people I am." Those words struck her harder than any fight, any heartbreak, any memory. Because for the first time in years, Elvis wasn't performing, he wasn't hiding, he wasn't protecting anyone. He was asking for help. And that was the moment she realized the truth she had avoided for far too long. The man on the other end of the line wasn't the king of rock and roll. He wasn't the legend, the icon, the indestructible figure the world worshipped. He was the boy she met at 14. The boy who whispered his secrets into the dark. The boy who needed her. And he was slipping. She didn't know then that this was the beginning of his final confession, the truth he'd been circling since the moment he dialed her number. But she felt it. Something was unraveling. Something he'd been hiding from everyone else. And she knew, deep in her bones, that he had called her because there was only one person he trusted enough to finally say it to. And the question that's followed her for nearly half a century is simple. If she had pushed him just a little harder, would he have told her everything? Would he still be here? She still doesn't know the answer. But she remembers the fear in his voice. And she remembers knowing, without knowing why, that something irreversible was coming. And in that moment, the quiet bond they shared tightened one last time, right before the world shattered. He took a long breath before he spoke again, and Priscilla felt something shift, like a door quietly opening somewhere inside him. She'd heard Elvis hesitantly emotional before, but she had never heard this tone. This wasn't sadness. This wasn't nostalgia. This was a man standing on the edge of something he knew he couldn't climb back from. And she sensed it instantly. When he finally said her name again, it cracked on the way out, and she felt her whole body tense. "Pris, I need to tell you something." Her fingers curled around the phone until her knuckles ached. Those words meant something specific coming from him. Elvis never announced his feelings. He hinted, he joked, he performed around them, but he never walked toward truth unless something inside him had pushed hard enough. She whispered, "I'm listening." There was a silence so long she thought he'd lost the nerve to continue. She was about to speak again when he finally exhaled and said, I don't think I've been myself for a long time." Her heart dropped. Not because she was surprised, but because he had finally admitted it. Elvis had always been the kind of man who carried his burdens behind closed doors. She had seen him exhausted, overwhelmed, angry, lonely, but he hid those pieces from everyone else, even from her most of the time. Hearing him acknowledge, it now made her realize just how deep the fracture had gone. She didn't interrupt. She didn't try to comfort him. She knew he needed the silence to keep talking. And he did. "You know how people look at me," he said softly, "like I'm supposed to be bigger than all this, stronger than all this." He paused again, and when he continued, his voice lowered to a whisper. "But I'm tired, Pris. I'm tired in a way I can't fix." She shut her eyes. Those words haunted her for years afterward, repeating in her mind like a warning she hadn't understood at the time. He continued, his voice trembling with something she could only describe as fear. You ever get the feeling that you're losing pieces of yourself, one by one? Her throat tightened. She remembered that sentence too clearly. She remembered the way it scraped against something deep inside her. Because if anyone understood what it meant to lose yourself piece by piece, it was her. She had lived it alongside him. But he wasn't speaking metaphorically that night. There was something literal in the way he said it, something urgent. "Elvis, what's going on?" she finally asked. This time he didn't dodge the question. He didn't laugh or change the subject. He didn't put on that charming deflection he used whenever he felt seen too clearly. Instead, he said the words she'd never expected to hear from the man who had seemed immortal to the world. "I'm scared," he whispered, "and I don't know how to tell anyone else." A small sound escaped her, part gasp, part heartbreak, but she forced herself to keep her voice steady. "You can tell me," she said. "You always could." He let out a shaky breath, relieved and afraid all at once. Then the truth finally began to spill out. "At night, when everyone's gone and the house gets quiet, it feels like it's closing in on me." She felt her chest tighten again. He continued, slowly, as if confessing the pieces one by one. "I hear noises that aren't there. I think about things that don't make sense. I forget conversations I had just a few hours before. I walk into rooms and can't remember why." She felt a tear slip down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. He wasn't done. "I don't tell anyone. I pretend I'm fine. I pretend I'm in control, but I'm not." And then came the confession that cut through her like a blade. "I think something's wrong with me, Pris, really wrong." Her breath caught. For the first time she realized this wasn't emotional fear. This was physical, psychological, something slipping beneath the surface. She whispered his name, but he kept talking, as if he'd damned himself for too long, and now the truth was pouring through the cracks. "You know, I've always had people around me," he said, "but they don't see me, not really. They see the part they want, the part they need, the part that pays their bills." He paused, as if gathering strength. "But you saw me, you always saw me." That was the sentence that shattered her. She remembered all the times he'd told her she didn't understand him, all the years of distance and miscommunication. Hearing him say now, so late, so fragile, that she had seen him when others hadn't, it rewrote everything. He wasn't confessing for pity. He wasn't reaching for nostalgia. He was reaching for the only version of himself he trusted. She felt another tear fall. "Elvis, you're not alone," she whispered. He let out a quiet, broken laugh. "Yes, I am," he said, "more than you think." She shook her head, even though he couldn't see it. "I'm here." A long silence followed, and then, with a voice full of something she'd never heard from him, not even during their hardest years, he said, "I'm calling because I don't know how much longer I can hold everything together." Her pulse stumbled. He hadn't said he was dying. He hadn't said anything dramatic, but the sentence carried a heavy, unspoken truth, a truth she didn't fully grasp until later. She swallowed hard. "Why didn't you tell anyone before now?" "Because I didn't think they'd care the way you would." Her breath hitched again. "And because," he added, barely above a whisper, "I didn't want anyone to see me like this." The world had always demanded the brightest, largest version of him. Elvis didn't know how to be vulnerable in front of people who depended on him. Admitting weakness to them felt like failing them. But admitting weakness to her was different. He trusted her with the truth he couldn't bear to show the world. She felt something inside her ache, so deeply she didn't think it would ever heal. He continued, voice trembling with emotional exhaustion. "I feel like I'm fading, Pris, like I'm slipping away from myself, like the man I used to be is somewhere far behind me." Her throat closed. He wasn't being poetic. He was telling her what he feared most. She tried to steady her breath. "You're still you," she whispered. But he didn't believe it. She could hear the disbelief in the way he answered. "I don't feel like him anymore." Another silence, and then, "I feel like a ghost in my own life." That sentence haunted her for decades, the vulnerability in it, the clarity, the pain. Elvis wasn't talking about career pressure or agging or fame. He was talking about identity, about losing the one thing he'd spent his life protecting. She remembered every detail, every pause, every trembling breath. And then came the moment, the turning point she would relive over and over, asking herself if she should have stopped him, or pushed him, or begged him to slow down. The sentence he said next wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it held a weight that reshaped everything she thought she knew about him. "I never told anyone, but I think something is going to happen to me." Her heart dropped to her stomach. "Elvis, don't say that," she whispered. "I can feel it," he said. "Something coming. I don't know what it is. I just know I'm not ready." Her breath trembled. "What do you mean?" she asked. He hesitated, then spoke in a tone so soft she almost missed it. "I've been having these moments where I feel like I'm not going to wake up." A cold numbness spread through her. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't being dramatic. He was telling her, in the only way he knew how, that he felt his life slipping away. Her voice shook. "Elvis, listen to me." But he spoke over her gently, not dismissively. "I don't want you worrying. I just needed you to know, needed someone to know." She felt her heart splinter. He had carried this fear completely alone. And he had chosen her, after everything, after all the years, to hold this truth with him. A truth he had never given to anyone else. She closed her eyes, fighting tears that burned at the back of her throat. "Elvis, why me?" she whispered. He took a breath, a long, heavy, heartbreaking breath. "Because you were there at the beginning," he said, "and I want you to know the truth at the end." She stopped breathing entirely. The end. He didn't say it dramatically, he didn't mean it like a prophecy. But she heard it, the weight, the fear, the resignation. She reached for words, comfort, reassurance, anything, but nothing made it past her lips. Nothing seemed large enough to meet the moment. And maybe he felt that. Maybe he sensed the silence behind her breath, because that was when he added something soft and devastating. "Pris, I'm tired of pretending I'm okay." Her heart broke in a way she couldn't explain. Because she knew, deep down, instinctively, that this wasn't just a bad night. He was telling her the thing he never told anyone. He needed help. The man the world saw as invincible was unraveling in quiet, unseen pieces. And he had come to her, not for nostalgia, not for comfort, but because he needed someone who knew the boy before the myth. She swallowed hard. "Elvis, you're not alone," she repeated. He inhaled slowly. "I know," he said, "that's why I called." Another silence, another long breath. And then, with a softness that made her shake, he said, "There's something else I need to tell you." Her pulse stumbled again. This was it. This was the confession he had been circling since the moment the phone rang. She opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, he whispered, "Please don't interrupt. I need to say it all." Her chest tightened with dread, with love, with fear. She said nothing. She waited. She listened. And in that fragile, suspended moment, just before the truth finally broke free, she felt something impossible to describe. A sense that her life was about to divide into two parts. Before this moment, and after. Because whatever he was about to say next, she knew instinctively, it would change everything. She never forgot the way he said her name right before the truth finally left his mouth. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't desperate, wasn't even loud. It was quiet, so quiet she almost leaned in without meaning to, as if closeness alone would help her understand the weight he was carrying. Pris, there's something I need you to hear. Those were the last steady words he managed. Everything after came out uneven, careful, almost confessed rather than spoken. Even now, she says it felt like he was handing her something he couldn't hold anymore, something fragile, something cracked, something he didn't trust anyone else with. I don't think I have much time, he whispered. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Not because she thought he meant it literally, it wasn't in his nature to speak of death, not even in the darkest hours. Elvis always believed tomorrow would fix everything, that there was always another chance, another solution, another spark of hope waiting somewhere. Hearing him say he felt time running out, that was new, that was terrifying. Don't say that, she whispered, her voice barely holding together. You're just tired, you're overwhelmed. But he shook his head on the other end. She could hear the motion in the soft rustle of the line. No, this feels different. Her heart hammered in her chest, panic rising, but something deeper too, something she hated admitting, even decades later. She felt a flicker of recognition. She sensed this heaviness in him for years. She'd seen it in the way he carried himself, in the way he hid behind routine and noise, and people who couldn't tell the difference between the man and the myth. She felt him slipping long before he said it aloud. He continued, voice trembling as if each word cost him something precious. I've been trying to fight it, I really have. The shows, the schedules, the pills, the people telling me I'm fine, it's all noise. I know what's happening. She closed her eyes as he spoke, trying to steady her breath, gripping the phone until her fingers cramped. She wanted to reach through the static and pull him back into himself, back into the man she once knew, the man who laughed easily, who dreamed out loud, who held her hand like he was afraid of losing her. But he kept talking. I'm losing pieces of myself, Pris, and I don't know how to stop it. Her voice cracked without her permission. You're not losing anything, you're just exhausted. Elvis Presley doesn't get to be exhausted, he interrupted, but it wasn't anger, it was truth, raw, sharp truth. She swallowed hard, trying to find something steady to hold onto inside herself. You're not just Elvis Presley, she said softly, you're still you. Another silence, another breath. That's the part I can't find anymore, he whispered. Those words stayed with her longer than his name ever did. They echoed in the quiet corners of her memory, followed her through decades of interviews, speeches, and moments where people asked her what Elvis was really like. Because they didn't know, they couldn't know. Only she had heard that confession. Only she knew he felt himself fading. And only she knew he reached for her when the truth became too heavy to hide. She didn't speak for a long moment, afraid that if she opened her mouth, her voice would betray all the fear she tried to swallow. But he filled the silence for her, as if sensing her struggle. I need you to promise me something. Her breath trembled. Promises between them had always carried weight, sometimes too much weight. What is it? He hesitated. She could hear it, the war between what he wanted to say and what he feared saying. His voice softened as he finally let it out. Don't let them forget who I really was. She blinked. Not fame, not legacy, not achievements, not titles, not the myth the world had built around him like a fortress he never asked for. Who he really was. The man behind the legend. The boy she met at 14. The sensitive, funny, insecure, generous soul who carried the world on his back, without ever admitting how heavy it was. Elvis, nobody could ever forget that, she whispered. But he didn't sound convinced. You'd be surprised, he said. People like stories more than truth. Her chest tightened. She thought of the books, the tabloids, the gossip, the stories written by people who weren't there. She thought of the rumors, the exaggerations, the headlines that painted him in colors that never matched the real thing. She thought of the way fame twists people until even those closest to them forget who they used to be. He sensed her silence and continued, his voice trembling in places it had never trembled before. You were the only one who knew me before all the noise, before the stage, before the lights, before the people telling me who to be. Her eyes strung. And I don't want the world to turn me into something I was. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady her voice, feeling a surge of emotion she hadn't expected, not guilt, not sorrow, but something deeper, something like responsibility. Elvis, she said quietly, I won't let that happen. He didn't respond at first, but then, with a tenderness that felt almost childlike, he whispered, I know. And then came the moment she would never speak of publicly, the moment she would carry privately, silently, into her 80s, the moment she only hinted at once when asked about her final conversation with him. There was a pause, a long, shaky pause, and she felt his breath hitch as he gathered what little strength he had left. Pris, I still think about us. The words struck her so hard she stopped breathing. Not because she didn't expect it, but because she didn't realize he still held their story so close. She didn't know if he meant regret, or love, or longing, or some mixture of all three. She didn't ask. She couldn't. The moment was too fragile to risk breaking. She whispered his name, and he swallowed hard before continuing. I don't mean I want to go back, he said gently. I don't want to die without you knowing that you were the best thing that ever happened to me. Her heart cracked wide open. He had never said those words to her before, not once, not even when they were in love. Elvis wasn't the kind of man who said best. He complimented, he adored, he praised, but he never placed anyone above anything, not because he didn't feel it, but because he didn't have the language for that kind of vulnerability. That night, he found it. Her voice broke, she couldn't help it. You meant the world to me too. He inhaled slowly, and she could hear the relief in it, the kind that sounds like someone finally putting down a weight they'd carried too long. The conversation drifted after that, into softer things, into memories that felt safer, into pieces of their life together that didn't hurt to touch. He asked about Lisa again, his voice warming slightly at her name. He asked if Priscilla was happy, if she felt steady, if she had people she could count on. It was almost tender, almost peaceful, until he said something that chilled her. I'm glad you answered tonight. She blinked hard, confusion tightening her throat. Why would you say that? Another pause. Another quiet, heartbreaking truth. Because I don't know if I'll get another chance to say any of this. A coldness spread through her that she couldn't shake, not even years later. Because deep down, she knew he wasn't talking about schedules or travel or timing. He felt something coming. She felt it too. But neither of them said it aloud. She reassured him softly, her voice trembling despite her efforts. He tried to steady himself once more, tried to sound calm, tried to push away the fear in his voice. But she could hear it. She could hear everything. Eventually the call softened, his voice grew quieter, slower, heavier, like a man trying to hold onto consciousness or clarity or hope. She stayed with him, murmuring small reassurances, letting the quiet fill the gaps. And then, in a voice so soft she almost missed it, he whispered his last words to her. Take care of our girl. She fought back tears. I will, I promise. He made a small sound, half gratitude, half exhaustion. Then he said something she still hears in her dreams. Good night, Pris. It wasn't final, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't staged for meaning. It was simple, ordinary, human. She didn't know it was the last time she would ever hear his voice. He did. She felt that truth only years later, when memory became a mirror that showed her what she couldn't see in the moment. That he was saying goodbye. Not to the world. Not to the legend. To her. To the one person he trusted with the truth he hid from everyone else. And at 88 years old, when she finally spoke about that call, she didn't do it to reopen wounds. She didn't do it to rewrite history. She didn't do it to claim something that wasn't hers. She did it because she realized the confession he handed her that night was never meant to disappear. It was meant to be told. Because the real Elvis Presley, the vulnerable, frightened, gentle soul behind the myth, deserved to be remembered. And someone had to speak for him. She had carried that truth for nearly half a lifetime. And when she finally let it out, she said it softly. He knew. 3 simple words. He knew he was slipping. He knew he was leaving. He knew time was running out. And he chose her for his last truth. Because she had been there at the beginning. And he wanted her to hold the end. Some stories don't fade when the world moves on. They stay suspended in memory, waiting for the moment someone finally becomes brave enough to tell the truth. Not the polished version, not the legend, but the heartbeat beneath it. Priscilla carried that final conversation like a quiet flame, protecting it from noise, from judgment, from anyone who might twist it into something it was. And now, hearing it through the voice of a woman who has lived nearly 9 decades, it becomes something deeper, an echo of a man who gave everything and asked for almost nothing in return. If you believe the real story of Elvis lives in moments like this, in the confessions, in the fear, in the love that outlasted time, stay with us. Because there are still pieces of his truth scattered across the years, and together we can bring them into the light.